February 19th, 1994. Dawn hasn't broken yet over Orleans County in northern Vermont, and 8 men are already gone. They left their homes sometime after midnight, fathers, sons, brothers-in-law, disappearing into the snow-choked wilderness of the Green Mountains with hunting rifles slung across their backs and vengeance burning in their chests. By the time the sun climbs over those frozen peaks, 11 people will be dead across 15 square miles of mountain territory. Not from avalanche, not from exposure, from bullets, clean shots, professional, the kind you make when you've spent 30 years tracking whitetail through these same forests, when you know every ridge and hollow, when you understand that in these mountains, sound carries for miles and silence is currency. The killers are the Bouchard family. Jean-Paul Bouchard, the patriarch, his 5 sons, 2 sons-in-law, 8 men total. What drives a father and his boys to hunt down their neighbors like animals? $22,000. That's the price tag. But it's not about money. It never really is it? It's about a stolen industrial maple syrup evaporator system, copper boiling pans, stainless steel tubing, propane burners, filtration equipment, 3 years of savings, the Bouchard's future, stolen in one night by the Holcomb family. Let me paint you the landscape where this happens. Orleans County, 697 square miles of mountain country where the Green Mountains punch up to 3,800 feet. 26,000 people scattered across valleys and ridges, down from 48,000 in the 1960s. This is timber country dying a slow death. The mills are closed. The jobs are gone. What's left? Desperation, pride, and the kind of silence that comes when a whole region watches its reason for existing get dismantled piece by piece. February in these mountains means nighttime temperatures hitting -15 Fahrenheit, daytime barely climbing to 25, 4 feet of snow burying everything. The smell, you can almost taste it, wood smoke from every chimney, frozen pine needles, ice forming on waterfalls, wind howling through bare hardwoods, trees cracking from the cold like rifle shots themselves. And that's the thing about winter forest. The acoustics are different. Every sound travels, every footstep on snow crunches, every breath fogs, every gunshot echoes. This is where our story lives, in the cold, in the silence, in the space between what's legal and what's just. Before we go further, I need you to understand something. This story is based on real events, real violence, real deaths. If you're sensitive to descriptions of violence, gun crime, or family tragedy, this isn't for you. I'm telling this story to examine what happens when systems fail people, when desperation meets pride, when communities collapse. This is documentary journalism, not glorification. If you have the courage to hear this truth, the ugly, complicated truth about what poverty and abandonment can do to human beings, hit that like button and subscribe. But I'm warning you, there are no heroes here, only choices and consequences. Everything you're about to hear happened. Now, let's continue. You need to understand the world Jean-Paul Bouchard lived in to understand why he did what he did. And I mean really understand it, not from some comfortable distance, but from inside the cold and the hunger and the humiliation. 1994. For northern Vermont timber country, this isn't just another year. This is the end of everything. The last big mill in Orleans County shut down in '92. Before that, 3 others closed in the '80s. Each closure meant 100, 200 families suddenly cut loose. Men who'd worked timber since they were teenagers, whose fathers and grandfathers had worked timber, waking up one morning with no trade, no income, no prospects in a region where there's nothing else. Unemployment hits 38%. Not the polite, temporary kind where you collect benefits for a few months and find something else. The permanent kind. The kind that destroys you slowly. Food stamps. Welfare lines. Watching your kids wear the same worn-out clothes to school while you sit at home because driving to look for work that doesn't exist costs gas money you don't have. The Franco-Canadian families, people like the Bouchards whose ancestors crossed down from Quebec 100 years ago, they don't beg. It's cultural, generational. Pride runs deep. Self-sufficiency isn't a choice, it's identity. So when legal work disappears, you find other ways. You trap, you hunt, you cut firewood, and if you're smart and desperate enough, you tap maple trees. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Green Mountain National Forest, federal land, has thousands of acres of old-growth sugar maples, perfect for syrup production. Huge trees, mature sap systems, pristine spring water. There are regulations, of course, permits, fees, monitoring. But the nearest ranger station is 50 miles away. And in winter, they barely patrol. The forest is yours if you're willing to risk it. Jean-Paul Bouchard and families like his, they've been running illegal sugaring operations for years by this point. Deep in the backcountry where nobody goes in winter, they haul equipment in on snowmobiles, tap the trees, collect sap in barrels, boil it down to syrup in wood-fired evaporators hidden in hunting cabins and lean-tos. It's hard work, dangerous work. You're out there in -20 weather, tending fires, hauling 50-pound containers through waist-deep snow. But it's honest work, in its way. You're not stealing from anybody. You're just taking what the forest offers. And the money, if you do it right, the money's decent. Grade A Vermont maple syrup sells for $40, $50 a gallon wholesale. You can move it through Montreal, through Boston, through the farmers market networks that don't ask too many questions. A good season? You can clear 15, 20,000. Enough to keep your family fed, your mortgage paid, your dignity intact. But you need equipment. Professional equipment. Industrial-grade stainless steel evaporators with precise temperature controls, efficient burners, good filtration systems. That equipment costs money. Real money. $22,000 for a setup that can process 500 gallons of sap a day. Jean-Paul Bouchard spent 3 years saving for his system. 3 years of every spare dollar, every good season's profits, building toward that goal. Because that equipment represented something bigger than syrup production. It represented independence, the ability to feed his family without government handouts, without bowing to a system that had already taken everything else. That equipment was his future. Until the morning of February 6th, when he snowmobiled out to his sugaring camp and found it gone. Jean-Paul Bouchard was 49 years old in February of 1994, but if you saw him, you'd guess 60. Maybe older. That's what 28 years of timber work does to a body. He stood 5'11", but stooped, shoulders permanently rounded from decades of chainsaw work, of bending to cut, of shouldering logs. His hands, you need to picture these hands, massive calloused things with scars layered on scars. 3 fingers on his left hand were noticeably shorter than they should be. Chainsaw accident, 1978. Happened so fast he didn't even feel it at first, just looked down and saw his fingertips lying in the sawdust. The scar that ran the length of his back, though, that one had a story. 1983. A widowmaker, what loggers call a dead tree that's still standing, came down wrong, crushed him against another trunk. They said it was a miracle he survived, but Jean-Paul never talked about it that way. He walked with a limp afterward, worse in cold weather. On February mornings when the temperature dropped below 0, that right leg barely worked. You could hear him coming, the uneven footsteps, the slight drag. But every morning, same routine. 4:45 a.m. the alarm clock rings. Not that he needs it. 30 years of this schedule have his body trained. He makes coffee in the same battered enamel pot his mother used, the kind that's half rust, half memory. While it percolates on the wood stove, he pulls out his grandmother's Catholic prayer book. 1947 edition, pages yellowed, spine cracked. He reads the morning prayers in French, the old French, Quebec French, not the cleaned-up version they teach in schools. Then he stands at the kitchen window watching dawn break over Lake Memphremagog. The lake freezes solid by January, 2 feet of ice covered in snow. Some mornings you can hear it. The ice groaning, shifting, cracking like distant thunder. He rolls a cigarette. Not store-bought, he hasn't bought a pack since the mill closed. Loose tobacco, rolling papers. Takes him 20 minutes to smoke it, standing there in the dark kitchen with just the wood stove crackling and the coffee smell and the cold pressing against the windows. Then the work begins. He dresses in layers, thermal underwear, wool shirts, canvas work pants, insulated coveralls. Pulls on pack boots rated to -40, climbs on his snowmobile, a 1986 Ski-Doo that's more rust and repair than original parts, but still runs. 3 miles through the forest to his sugaring operation. In the dark, by headlight, following trails only he knows. When he gets there, he checks every tap, hundreds of them, spiles driven into sugar maples, plastic tubing running sap down to collection tanks. He monitors the evaporator, feeding the fire, watching the temperature gauge, making sure the boil is steady. Raw sap is mostly water. 40 gallons boils down to 1 gallon of syrup. It takes hours of constant attention. The steam rises in great clouds, smelling sweet, almost caramel. The finished product, when you do it right, is amber perfection. Grade A, light amber, the kind that Montreal restaurants pay premium prices for. This was Jean-Paul's cathedral. Not the Catholic church his grandmother dragged him to as a child. This, the forest, the steam, the honest alchemy of turning sap into gold. This was where he met God, where he felt human, where 3 shortened fingers and a ruined back didn't matter because the work was his and the product was his, and nobody could take that away. Except somebody did. Jean-Paul Bouchard married Claire Dubois in 1967, 2 months after he got back from Vietnam. He doesn't talk about the war, most of the guys who went don't, but Claire knew what she was getting when she married him, a man with nightmares, a man who flinched at loud noises, a man who needed the forest because cities, crowds, closed spaces made something in his chest tighten until he couldn't breathe. She was 18 when they married. He was 22. They had their first son, Michel, 9 months later. Then André, Luc, Philippe, and finally Etienne. 5 boys in 8 years. The house was chaos, constant noise, constant motion, constant need. But Claire handled it the way Franco-Canadian women of her generation handled everything. Silently, efficiently, without complaint. By 1994, Claire is 48 years old. Thin in that hard way women get when they've spent decades stretching food, stretching money, stretching everything to make it last. Her hair went gray early, started in her 30s, fully white by 40. People said it was stress, and maybe it was. Her father died in a logging accident when she was 12. Her uncle, 2 years later, same way. She grew up understanding that the men in her life did dangerous work, that every morning they left might be the last time she saw them whole. Now, she lives with a different kind of fear. Her husband and sons aren't just risking their bodies anymore. They're risking prison. Federal charges for operating an illegal sugaring operation on national forest land. She knows what they're doing out there in the mountains. She knows they could get caught. But what's she supposed to say? Stop feeding your family. Take the welfare instead. Accept the shame. The boys, men now really, range from 27 to 21. Michel, the oldest, already has 2 kids of his own. André is engaged. They're all big men, built like their father, with the same quiet intensity, the same stubborn pride. They've all worked timber since they were teenagers. They've all watched the industry collapse. They've all seen their options narrow to nothing. For Jean-Paul, the sugaring operation isn't about money. I mean, yes, they need the money, desperately. But it's bigger than that. It's about refusing to be broken, about looking his sons in the eye and showing them that a man doesn't beg, doesn't surrender, doesn't let the system that destroyed his livelihood then demand gratitude for food stamps. The industrial evaporator system, that $22,000 they saved over 3 years, represented something almost sacred. Jean-Paul's great-grandfather ran a sugaring operation during the Great Depression. His grandfather did it after World War II. This was generational. This was identity. Those copper boiling pans, that stainless steel, those precise temperature controls, they weren't just equipment. They were a middle finger to everyone who said timber families were finished, obsolete, disposable. They were proof that the Bouchards could still make something of value, still contribute, still stand independent. And here's what Claire understood, lying awake at night listening to Jean-Paul's uneven breathing, feeling him tense beside her. Her husband had already lost too much, his fingers, his back, his trade, his dignity. The evaporator system was the line. The last thing he had that was his, that he'd built with his own hands, his own sweat, his own refusal to quit. When it got stolen, when the Holcombs cut the locks on his shed, loaded everything onto a truck, and disappeared into the night. They didn't just take equipment. They took the last piece of Jean-Paul Bouchard that still believed the world could be fair if you worked hard enough. And Claire knew, watching her husband's face that February morning when he came home to tell her, she knew exactly what was about to happen. She'd been married to this man for 27 years. She knew what he looked like when he'd made a decision that nothing could reverse. Curtis Holcomb was 41, a massive man running to fat with a red beard gone patchy and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow where a chainsaw chain had snapped years back. He fixed old snowmobiles for cash, no questions asked, no receipts, no taxes. Before the mills closed, he'd done mechanic work legitimately, had a shop, employees, a future. Now he worked out of a shed behind his brother's trailer, drinking steadily through each day, watching his life shrink. His brothers, Dwight, Russell, Trenton, and their cousin Neil were in similar shape. Odd jobs on farms, construction work when they could find it. Mostly they survived on whatever scheme came along, whatever they could scrape together. They weren't evil men, not really, just desperate ones. The kind of desperate that makes stealing from your neighbors start to seem reasonable. The night of February 5th, 1994, the Holcomb brothers made a decision. They knew about Jean-Paul's sugaring operation. Everybody in the county knew, or at least suspected. They knew about that $22,000 evaporator system sitting in an unlocked shed 3 miles into the forest. They knew Jean-Paul was running illegal, which meant he couldn't report the theft to authorities without exposing himself. Perfect crime, right? Who's going to call the cops over stolen equipment when the equipment itself is evidence of federal violations? So they went in with a pickup truck, bolt cutters, and just enough conscience left to feel guilty but not enough to stop. The copper pans alone were worth $7,000 as scrap. The stainless steel, the burners, the filtration system, all of it valuable. They figured they could move the whole setup through scrap dealers in Burlington for $11,000, maybe $12,000. Split 5 ways, that's enough to buy some time, catch up on the mortgage, keep the power on another few months. They loaded everything in darkness, heavy work, awkward, the metal banging against truck sides, their breath fogging in the cold. Nobody said much. What was there to say? They all knew what they were doing. They all knew whose desperation they were converting into their own temporary relief. The next morning, February 6th, Jean-Paul snowmobiled out to his camp at first light. He knew something was wrong before he even reached the shed. The snow around it was churned up, torn by tire tracks. The padlock hung broken. Inside, empty, everything gone. 3 years of savings, his family's future, the independence he'd fought so hard to maintain, vanished. He stood there for a long time, they say, just stood in that empty shed while the temperature climbed toward 20 degrees and the sun turned the snow brilliant white. Then he got back on his snowmobile and rode directly to Curtis Holcomb's place. The confrontation was brief. Jean-Paul didn't yell. Men like Jean-Paul don't yell. He simply said, "I know you took it. Return it." Curtis, probably half drunk already, it was barely 9 a.m., got defensive, aggressive, came out holding a hunting rifle, pointing it at Jean-Paul's chest. "Get off my property. I don't know what you're talking about. Leave now or I'll shoot you for trespassing." Jean-Paul looked at him for a long moment. This is what witnesses later reported, that Jean-Paul just stared at Curtis with this expression they couldn't quite describe. Not angry, not threatening. Something colder. Then he said, quiet enough that Curtis had to strain to hear, "You have 12 days. Return what you stole or pay me $22,000. After that, there will be consequences you don't want." He turned his snowmobile around and left. Curtis watched him go, still holding the rifle, probably feeling tough, feeling like he'd won that confrontation. He had no idea what he'd just started. None of them did. Jean-Paul Bouchard gave the Holcombs 12 days. 12 days to do the right thing, 12 days to return what they'd stolen or come up with the money. It wasn't an arbitrary number, it was calculated. Maple sap season runs February through March in Vermont, maybe 6 weeks total when temperatures cycle above freezing during the day and below at night. That temperature swing is what makes the sap run. Without his evaporator system, Jean-Paul was losing money every single day. 12 days was already a quarter of his season gone. It was generous considering. The Holcombs didn't return the equipment, they didn't call, they didn't try to negotiate. They simply ignored him, probably hoping he'd give up, maybe thinking he was all talk. When Jean-Paul tried calling Curtis's house, nobody answered. When he drove past their properties, they made themselves scarce. They weren't even trying to make this right. They were just hoping it would go away. It wouldn't go away. February 17th, the deadline expired. No equipment, no money, no contact. Jean-Paul sat at his kitchen table that evening with topographic maps spread out in front of him. The maps showed every ridge, every hollow, every logging road in Orleans County. He'd marked locations, where Curtis lived, where his brother stayed, where Neil's girlfriend had a cabin, where they did their drinking. He knew their routines the way a hunter knows deer patterns. He'd been watching them for 12 days. His sons gathered that night: Michel, André, Luc, Philippe, Etienne. His sons-in-law, Mark and Daniel. 8 men total around that kitchen table, with Claire in the next room pretending not to hear, pretending not to understand what was being planned. Jean-Paul didn't ask them to come. He didn't have to. This was family. When one was wronged, all were wronged. When one needed to act, all acted. This is how it works in families like the Bouchards, families that came up through poverty and pride, families where blood meant something absolute. Jean-Paul assigned each man a target, a location, a time. He distributed hunting rifles, U-8, Winchesters, 30-06 Remingtons, the same weapons they used every November for deer season. He showed them the routes on the maps, the approach angles, the escape paths. They would go in on snowmobiles, quiet, mobile, able to navigate forest terrain that trucks couldn't reach. They would strike fast and disappear into the mountains before anyone could respond. In winter, in that territory, they had every advantage. They knew the land. They had the equipment. They had the motivation. The next 3 days were preparation. They checked their snowmobiles, tuned the engines, filled gas cans. They sighted in their rifles at a makeshift range deep in the forest where nobody would hear. They packed thermoses of coffee, emergency supplies, extra ammunition. Jean-Paul drilled them on the plan over and over until everyone knew their role perfectly. This wasn't rage. This wasn't passion. This was cold, methodical planning. Jean-Paul had learned something in Vietnam that most men never learn: how to turn off the part of yourself that hesitates, that questions, that feels, how to become purely functional. Claire watched the preparations and said nothing. What could she say? Her husband had made his choice. Her sons had made theirs. She could scream, she could beg, she could threaten to leave. None of it would change anything. So she did what women in her position have done for generations. She kept the house running, she cooked meals, she prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. On the evening of February 17th, she watched Jean-Paul at the table reading psalms in French from his grandmother's prayer book. The ones about divine retribution, the ones about the righteous being vindicated against the wicked. He ran his finger along the verses, his lips moving silently. Then he closed the book, stood up, and began checking ammunition. Boxes of .308 rounds, boxes of .36. He loaded magazines methodically, 30 rounds each, the brass cartridges clicking into place with that distinct metallic sound. He filled thermoses with coffee, black and strong. He laid out his winter gear, the insulated coveralls, the pack boots, the balaclava that would hide his face. At 10 p.m. on February 17th, 8 men walked out of the Bouchard house and climbed onto their snowmobiles. The machines started with that distinctive 2-stroke whine, blue exhaust smoke rising into the cold night air. Claire stood at the kitchen window watching them leave, 8 sets of taillights disappearing into the forest. She knew, the way you know things in your bones, in your blood, that her life was ending. Not physically, not yet, but the life she'd built, the family she'd raised, the future she'd imagined. All of it was riding away on those snowmobiles into the frozen darkness, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do but wait. The hunting began just after midnight on February 18th. The Bouchard moved through the forest the way they'd moved through it their entire lives, silent, efficient, reading the terrain without thinking about it. Snowmobiles running on the edge of idle, just enough power to move, but not enough to be heard from a distance. They communicated through handheld radios, short bursts of French, using the old Quebec dialect their grandparents spoke. If anyone intercepted the transmissions, they wouldn't understand what was being said. Michel and André took the first target, a trailer where 3 of the Holcomb cousins were staying, remote location off a logging road nobody maintained anymore. They approached on foot for the last 100 yards, leaving the snowmobiles hidden in tree cover. The trailer had lights on inside, the blue flicker of a television visible through the window. Michel positioned himself on one side, André on the other. They could see shapes inside, men sitting on a couch, beer cans on the table. Through the radio, "Ready? Ready!" 2 shots, maybe 3 seconds apart. The television kept flickering, but the shapes were down. They were back on their snowmobiles and gone before the echoes stopped bouncing off the mountains. Luc and Philippe had a more complicated assignment, a house where 2 brothers lived with their families. Jean-Paul had been clear. Families meant witnesses, witnesses meant complications. Wait for the men to be alone. They waited in the tree line for nearly 2 hours, watching through rifle scopes. Finally, around 2:30 a.m., one of the targets came outside, probably to smoke, probably couldn't sleep. The cold had him hunched over, hands in his pockets. The shot took him in the chest from 100 yards. The sound brought the second brother running out the door. Second shot, both down in the snow while the families inside slept. Luc and Philippe were gone before the screaming started. This is how it went through the night. Systematic. Professional. The Bouchards had hunted these mountains for decades, had tracked deer and bear through terrain most people couldn't navigate in daylight. Doing this in the dark, in winter, to human targets who weren't expecting it, it was almost too easy. Almost insulting how easy it was. Men silhouetted in doorways, men walking to their trucks for early shift work, men isolated in hunting cabins they thought were safe. Each team knew their assignment, executed it, and disappeared. The radios crackled with brief confirmations in French. Fate. Done. Fate. Done. Fate. Jean-Paul himself took Curtis Holcomb. He'd reserved that one, earned it through the theft, through the disrespect. Through that moment, Curtis pointed a rifle at his chest and told him to leave. He found Curtis in his shed working on a snowmobile, probably stolen, probably planning to sell. The shed door was open, spilling light onto the snow. Curtis had his back turned, bent over an engine, wrench in hand. Jean-Paul stood in the doorway for maybe 10 seconds, just watching, giving Curtis that long to feel the presence behind him, to start to turn. The shot caught him mid-turn. Jean-Paul didn't stay to watch him fall, just turned and walked back to his snowmobile, methodical as ever. By dawn on February 19th, 11 people were dead across 15 square miles of mountain territory. 11 Holcombs and their associates, each one involved in the theft, either directly or through family connection. The Bouchard teams regrouped at a prearranged location deep in the national forest, compared notes, confirmed everyone was accounted for. Then they separated, taking different routes home, their snowmobile tracks already being covered by fresh snow that had started falling around 4 a.m. By the time the sun came up, you couldn't tell anyone had been there. The sheriff's department got the first call at 6:47 a.m. A woman hysterical, barely coherent, saying her husband was dead in the snow outside their house. Then another call. Then 3 more. By 7:30, Sheriff Dale Morrison realized he wasn't dealing with isolated incidents. He was dealing with something he'd never seen in 30 years of law enforcement, something that required help he didn't have. The FBI arrived from Burlington by noon. Special agents, forensic teams, the full apparatus of federal investigation, descending on a county that rarely saw anything worse than bar fights and domestic disturbances. Special Agent Catherine Morris took command of the operation. She was 43, veteran of organized crime investigations, someone who'd seen violence at scale. But even she was unsettled by what she found in Orleans County that February day. 11 bodies spread across a geographic area that should have been impossible to cover in one night, especially in winter conditions. Yet the kills showed coordination, planning, military precision. The ballistics would later confirm what she suspected immediately: multiple shooters using hunting rifles, long-range shots, most victims killed with single rounds. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't passion. This was execution. The evidence trail didn't take long to establish. Snowmobile tracks everywhere, partially filled by new snow but still visible. Shell casings at some sites, though many shooters had policed their brass. Most importantly, every single victim connected to the Holcomb family, and every Holcomb connected to one thing: the theft of Jean-Paul Bouchard's Evaporator system. Local witnesses talked. In small communities, everyone knows everything. People had seen the confrontation at Curtis's house 12 days prior. They'd heard about the deadline. They'd watched the Holcombs ignore it. Some had even warned the Holcombs to return the equipment, told them Jean-Paul wasn't someone to cross. The Holcombs had laughed it off. Franco-Canadian bluster, they'd said. Old man making threats he couldn't back up. By February 21st, Agent Morris had warrant applications ready. By February 22nd, 8 arrest teams moved simultaneously on the Bouchard properties. They found the men at home. No resistance, no flight. Jean-Paul was drinking coffee at his kitchen table when agents came through the door. He looked up, unsurprised, and set down his cup carefully. "I'll need my coat," he said in English, accent thick. "It's cold." They arrested all 8, Jean-Paul, his 5 sons, his 2 sons-in-law, took them to separate holding facilities to prevent communication. But there was no need. They'd already agreed on what they'd say, which was almost nothing. When Agent Morris interviewed Jean-Paul, he gave her one statement in English so there would be no misunderstanding. "They stole bread from my children's mouths. They were warned. They refused to make it right. So we did. That's all." "You killed 11 people," Morris said. "Over $22,000. Jean-Paul looked at her with those cold, flat eyes. "No," he said. "Over respect. Over a man's right to feed his family. Over a system that took everything from us and then punished us for surviving. $22,000 was just the number. You wouldn't understand." And maybe she didn't. Maybe nobody could, who hadn't lived through what these communities lived through, watching their entire economy disappear, watching their futures get sold off to corporate interests somewhere else. But understanding wasn't Morris's job. Evidence was, and the evidence was overwhelming. The trial began in June of 1994. The prosecution was straightforward. First-degree murder, 11 counts for each defendant. Premeditation was obvious, the planning, the coordination, the execution. The defense tried several strategies: temporary insanity brought on by extreme duress, diminished capacity from economic trauma, even a kind of cultural defense, arguing that Franco-Canadian timber communities operated under different codes of justice, that the Bouchards were following traditions older than American law. None of it worked. The jury, 12 Vermont residents, people who understood the economic collapse, who probably knew families just like the Bouchard, they understood the context, the desperation, even the twisted logic, but they couldn't excuse it. Murder is murder. 11 people dead, including men who'd only been tangentially involved, some who probably didn't even know about the theft until afterward. This wasn't justice. This was massacre. The testimony was devastating. Widows of the Holcombs took the stand, describing the moment they found their husbands. Children testified, 17 kids left without fathers, some of them toddlers who'd never remember the men who died. They cried in the courtroom. Some couldn't finish their statements. The defense tried to paint the Holcombs as thieves who'd brought this on themselves. But how do you say that while children are sobbing 10 feet away? The Bouchards showed no emotion through any of it. They sat in the defendant box, 8 men ranging from 50 down to 23, and they didn't flinch, didn't cry, barely even blinked. Jean-Paul in the center, his sons on either side, like some grim family portrait. When the prosecution showed crime scene photos, bodies in snow, blood frozen black against white, Jean-Paul's expression didn't change. This wasn't callousness. This was the same mechanism that had allowed him to do it in the first place. You don't survive what these men survived by letting yourself feel everything. You shut it off. Claire testified for the defense, though her testimony probably hurt more than it helped. She described the poverty, the desperation, the systematic destruction of their community. She described watching her husband break under the weight of unemployment, of humiliation, of seeing his life's work declared worthless. She described the theft as the final blow, the thing that finally snapped something that had been bending for years. But when the prosecutor asked if she'd known what her husband was planning, She paused too long before saying no. Everyone in that courtroom knew she was lying. Everyone knew she'd let it happen. August 15th, 1994. The jury came back after 2 days of deliberation, guilty on all counts, all 8 defendants. The sentencing took another week. Jean-Paul got life without possibility of parole. His sons got 30 to 45 years each, depending on their level of participation. The sons-in-law, who'd been following orders rather than giving them, got 20 to 35. Jean-Paul stood for sentencing, and the judge asked if he had anything to say. He looked at the Holcomb widows, at the orphaned children, at Agent Morris sitting in the back of the courtroom. Then he said, in that thick Quebec accent, "I am sorry for your loss, but I'm not sorry for what I did. They took what was mine. The law would not help. So I helped myself. This is how men lived for thousands of years. Maybe your law is better, but it failed us first." The judge, an older man who'd probably heard every excuse, just shook his head. "Mr. Bouchard, society cannot function if everyone takes the law into their own hands. You had options. You chose murder. Now you'll spend the rest of your life in prison thinking about that choice." Jean-Paul sat down, his face blank, his future ended. Jean-Paul Bouchard entered the Vermont state prison system in August 1994 at age 49. By 2008, he had advanced dementia, couldn't remember his own name most days. By 2013, he didn't recognize Claire during her visits, though by then she was visiting less and less. The strong man who'd commanded his family, who'd executed 11 people with cold precision, who'd stood defiant in court, that man was gone. What remained was a confused old man who sometimes spoke in French about logging trees that didn't exist anymore, who thought he was back in Vietnam, who cried for his mother. Claire lasted until 1999. Heart attack, the death certificate said, but anyone who knew her understood it was grief that killed her. 5 years of driving to the prison, sitting across from a husband who was spiritually dead even if his body kept functioning. 5 years of watching her sons age in prison cells, watching them turn into the kind of hard men that prison creates. 5 years of being the woman whose family had committed the Vermont massacre, of walking through town while people whispered, of existing in the space between sympathy and horror. Her heart simply gave up. The sons fared differently. Michel, the oldest, found religion in prison, became someone the other inmates respected. He got out in 2027 after 33 years, a 60-year-old man returning to a world he didn't recognize. André lasted until 2002 before hanging himself in his cell. No note, no explanation. Just one morning, he was gone. Luc and Philippe are still inside, both eligible for parole hearings that keep getting denied. Etienne, the youngest, got out in 2018, lives somewhere in Canada now, works in construction under a different name. The sons-in-law served their time and disappeared. Nobody knows where they went. On the Holcomb side, the damage was generational. 11 widows, 17 orphans, financial collapse without breadwinners. The families lost their homes, scattered across New England seeking work or relatives willing to take them in. The children grew up with trauma that no therapy could fully address. Some thrived despite it, became successful in defiant rejection of their circumstances. Others fell apart. Addiction, mental illness, suicide attempts. You can draw a direct line from that February night in '94 to broken lives still unfolding 3 decades later. The properties themselves, both Bouchard and Holcomb lands, became cursed in local imagination. The Bouchard farm sat empty for years, gradually collapsing. Someone tried to renovate it in 2007, but the place burned down under suspicious circumstances. Nobody was ever charged. The land, sold for almost nothing in 2011, sits undeveloped now. The Holcomb properties went to auction in 2001 to pay debts. A developer from Boston bought them, planned to build vacation homes, lasted one winter before giving up. Bad energy, he told the realtor. Something wrong with that land. Orleans County itself reacted in complicated ways. Immediately after the massacre, there was unity. Shared horror bringing people together, vigils and memorials and promises to heal. But within a year, old divisions reasserted themselves. Some people still saw the Bouchards as victims who'd been pushed too far. Others saw them as murderers who'd shamed the whole region. Arguments broke out at town meetings. Families stopped speaking to each other over it. The unity was temporary. The resentments were permanent. By 2025, Orleans County had largely forgotten the specifics while remembering the emotional residue. Younger people knew something terrible had happened but couldn't always recall details. The massacre became myth, became warning, became the kind of story parents told to explain why you don't push people too far, why you don't steal, why you handle disputes legally. The lesson everyone drew from it depended entirely on who was telling the story.